believe he created a framework where that's really true. So I'll show you why I believe that. And I also just know as a practitioner that I'm always anxious in every situation about whether it'll work or not. And so that is, it's not a freedom from, worrying, but it certainly has been a framework which has been almost perfect for my experience, which started in 1984. So there's, and the Lewin's whole intent, Kurt Lewin's, was that these methods be transferable, not just to, well, there were no OD people, but to anybody facing problems and trying to solve them. So let me bring up the slides. And my father, who intended to be here and still may show up if we are lucky, is there to my right. He first was in a T group, which was a method invented by Kurt Lewin in 1953, just 6 years after Kurt Lewin passed away. And he then was with Ron Lippitt, who was one of Lewin's close associates. For almost 30 years, he was mentored by this person, Ron Lippitt. And you can see some of the various books that we've written. You have the first chapter from this book, and you have my father's entire book, I believe. And so this particular book, Plan Change, came out of a series of critiques of Lewin. I kept hearing people say things and write things like his change model is too simple. And so I started to challenge some of that. And when I did so, I started reading Lewin's writing. And I realized that I had not really done so. Here I had been using his methods for 30 years, and I hadn't really studied his writing. And so this, my intent was, once I did that, was to organize it in a way that would make it more accessible to people. So that's really what this Plan Change book is about. So a little background, Kurt Lewin was born in Mogilno, which was a portion of Prussia at the time. Now it's part of Poland. He was a Jewish male living in really what was the Kaiser's Germany. And so even before Hitler and the Nazis came to power, he faced institutional racism that was law. So for instance, he taught at the University of Berlin and was not allowed to become a tenured professor because he was Jewish. It was against the law. It was against the law for Jewish people to own land. They had to find somebody else to own the land and hold the deed, then they could work it, but they weren't allowed to own it. So he faced various types of powerlessness. And so power and powerlessness was one of the sociological phenomenons that was very important to him as he put together his social science. And so there's more to come on that. So Lewin was radical at the time, back in the 1920s, 1930s in Berlin, and then he moved to the United States in the mid-1930s to escape Nazism. He was radical in saying, look, you can have science, use physical science methods. You can apply them to psychology. You can apply them to sociology. You can apply them to understanding group behavior. And it had never been done. So he took a simple process like plan, do, and assess, or in this case, fact finding. He took this simple process of steps and help people apply it to social issues and to performance improvement in organizations. And so any like process improvement, you can take it back to a couple sources, but certainly Lewin was one of the important sources. Now, part of what he believed based on experiments, he always was doing research, but he believed research should always be addressing real issues. So he called it action research. He thought that research that was just purely for knowledge but wasn't applied to real world issues was, in a sense, a waste of effort, because there are plenty of real world issues for us to address. And also he wanted to test theory in the actual world versus just having it be theory. So action research is what his methods came to be known as, but he called it training action research, because every time he did an intervention, training was part of the intervention. He would help people learn how to think differently about what they were facing and to talk to each other differently. And so be able to have dialogue even when they had differences. So there was always the three elements for him. And then you repeat. You go through the process, and it was a never-ending spiral, as he put it. So of particular importance then, applying the physical sciences, was the concept of homeostasis. In Lewin's social science, every system is in homeostasis. You have forces which are holding it in place. There's forces that are pushing it, but there's forces that are pulling it back. And so what people tend to do to try to change organizations is they will, let's say if they want more performance, they'll press for more performance. They will maybe add incentives to hopefully get more performance. So that's the carrot. They might add a stick. They might be more stern with the employees and try to get more performance. And so that increases tension in the system, and it can't be sustained. If you just drive and push, tension goes up. Eventually, the tension erodes the gains, in his way of thinking. So instead, what Lewin would have people do in all kinds of different circumstances is identify what's holding things back. To have a group dialogue about what he called the restraining forces. And so now he was a clever guy, because as soon as you have people who have not been invited to talk about what's happening, like workers in a plant, as soon as you actually say to them, look, you get to talk about what's working and not working, you get to help come up with solutions, you have already changed the homeostasis. You are already removing or weakening a restraining force, which in most places is that only the experts and only the management people are trying to do all the thinking and come up with the solutions. So there's a gap between who's thinking and who's doing. And that is a restraining force unto itself. So we will have time to talk about maybe some of your own situations, and I'm going to give some examples from our work. Dad was very excited to give some of these examples, so I feel sad that he's not here with us. At least I don't think he is. So, but there's many ways to make an impact on restraint. So I will say one, the very first thing I did with my father when I was only 24 years old, back in 1984, There was a city, the city we lived in, the city of Spokane, and there was a big conflict about what to do with the downtown portion of the city, which was a park and had been used for the World's Fair in 1974. And so there was this land there, and there was a dispute about what to do about it. And it was a bitter dispute. The park board was just, they didn't know how to deal with the angry citizens. There were citizens who thought that it was a plot to turn the whole thing into a theme park, and that the park board had already decided, and the mayor had decided, and that it was all already decided, and it was evil. And so they were angry. So the meetings were just people shouting. So Dad went into these meetings. He got hired to help somehow change the dynamics. And I just went along to help, carry pens and stuff for him and watch what happens and see if I could learn something. So what he did was he first let people shout some for each meeting. They'd shout for about 30 minutes, take turns shouting at him. They thought he was also part of the secret plot. Then he would get them into groups to work on different alternatives for the future of the park. And so every meeting, they'd start with shouting, and then soon they would get to work. And then they would come, what they did was they came up with 5 alternatives. And then we went out and got citizens to vote on the alternatives. And, sort of fortunate, there was an alternative that had a theme park. It didn't get voted on. People wanted it to be more like a green space. But instead of, he reduced the restraining force of mistrust by allowing people to engage in a process that was structured so they could influence the future. And it broke the deadlock, and the park is still that way now in 2021. It was designed that way back in 1984, and it has stuck. So one thing Lewin knew was you get the people in the room who are upset. You don't try to fix it without them. If at all possible, if you're working with workers and some of them are the most upset workers, get them involved in the conversation and coming up with solutions. So that's just one example of unfreezing, as Lewin put it, the homeostasis. But when people look at this model and say it's too simple, they aren't aware of the group dynamic methods that go with it. Even what was meant by unfreeze, which of course, if you're trying to change something, you're trying to get it to be different. That's all. So unfreeze the homeostasis, shift, and if at all possible, you're doing this with group dynamics, you've already started the change. As a matter of fact, you've already got to the new homeostasis. In a lot of the work I do, as soon as the people in the group really have a chance to influence, they've already created a new and more productive homeostasis. As soon as they've begun, the change has already started to occur that's most important. So it doesn't have to be a long process. I'll give you some more examples, but first, we're almost through the slides. So we're gonna have plenty of time to interact and chat here. Every time Lewin worked, he made it into a research activity. And so the US government wanted him to help many times. Once he was in the US and they realized what this guy could do, they wanted his help. For instance, we were going through the Dust Bowl years in the Midwest, so it was terrible drought. And the US government wanted the farmers to use different methods of irrigation, to be able to farm with less water. So they sent people in trains out to the Midwest. This is the late 1930s, and the U.S. government people came out and lectured to the farmers, and almost nothing got done as a result of the lectures. And this was a consistent truth for Lewin around group dynamics. So he went out there and he would have the same lecturer work with one group. Go ahead, lecture with this group. Let's track how that goes. And then now you're going to give a little bit of information to this group, but this group of farmers is going to talk amongst themselves about what they think of the recommendations from the government, about their own ideas, about how to modify the recommendations from the government, and come up with a group decision, is how he put it. It didn't necessarily mean that they voted. There was no formal authority in a group like that. But they said, okay, I'm going to do this. And other people committed to the same kind of action. It's a commitment that comes from peer dialogue. And then they would go out and get it done and to a high degree of implementation. If people are allowed to come up with solutions, they are much more likely to implement them successfully than if they are forced to follow somebody else's solutions. So the group dynamics and the unfreezing is to allow people to have to think for themselves to the extent possible. So this particular graphic then is around the government attempting to get mothers to use milk differently during World War II. And same result. If they just got lectured at, very little influence on the individuals. If they were allowed to have dialogue and come up with their own nuances and plans, high implementation success. Same thing true in a factory. Lewin worked really, this went on for like 30 years in this place called Harwood Manufacturing, because the owner was so happy with the results, he kept it going even after Lewin's death in 1947. Groups that were allowed to talk about how the work, what was holding the work back, what would make it go smoother, and experiment, were able to increase their productivity and their morale and decrease conflict. And the rest of the groups stayed pretty much the way they were if they didn't have that kind of intervention. So Lewin famously, at least it's famous to me, came up with this formula. He was very creative. Science is not about having the final answer. Science is about continuing to experiment. And so you learn things like what you're hearing today, and then you go out and experiment. And you don't have to do it exactly the way Lewin would have done it, or I would do it. It is a process of experimentation. And so he was constantly then experimenting with things like topography, which is map making, and applying that to sociology and psychology. And he was using physics and applying it to human psychology and behavior. And so this formula here, behavior is a function of personality and the environment, was radical again at the time. There was a big fight going on. Is it nature or is it nurture? Why do humans behave the way they do? Is it just because you're born this way, or is it because of the environment? And Lewin said it's both. Of course, it's both. And if, for instance, you have an organization where people are demoralized, it's not because they were born demoralized. There is something about the homeostasis in that organization which is causing demoralization. And it's going to be different in different individuals. Some will be more demoralized, some will be less. But the environment is a heavy influence, and you could shift it to where people are enjoying their work and having more energy and productivity. So you can change it the other way. You can change it either way. Most people don't want to change it on purpose to demoralization. That's unfortunately easy to accomplish by accident. But you can change it either way. So here's the last slide. This is getting back then to Lewin's social science being applied to power in society and in organizations. Forgive me if you get a little dizzy watching Mel Brooks go down into vertigo there. But in any organization or any society where there are power imbalances, then people are going to be on what Lewin called the margin. If, for instance, there's an imbalance in like racism, for instance, if there's a belief in society that there's different races, which is a socially constructed belief, we could maybe talk about that some more. And then there's a restriction and so on, like in Germany, when Lewin could not be a tenured professor at the University of Berlin. Some of it's subtle, some of it's overt. Then the people, even the people who have power, are going to be a little crazy because they're going to wonder if they're doing the wrong thing. They're going to feel defensive at times. They're going to, there's various ways it confuses everybody. Nobody escapes the problem. And the people who don't have power are going to wish they had more access, of course. They wish they were more like the people that did have power. On the other hand, they don't like the group that has power. And on the other hand, they don't really wish they were part of the group that doesn't have power. And so it leaves you wondering things like, if you're a woman and you can't advance in the organization, and it just happens that no women ever have advanced in that organization, you may be wondering, is it just because of gender bias? Or is it that I personally need to somehow change my behavior or increase my skills? Is it me or is it the environment? And it's going to be hard to ever know for sure. So sometimes when it is the environment, people are going to blame themselves. And other times when it is just them, they're just going to blame the environment. And so it creates all kinds of individual psychological issues if there are dysfunctions in the power, imbalances in society. So that was one reason why Lewin was determined to help, like the government had him work on race relations in Connecticut. And he did that by bringing people together, training them, bringing them together, having them figure out what they wanted to do in their communities. The same kind of approach. Unfortunately, that was 1946, and he passed away in early 1947. So that is a quick dip into Lewin's social science. So, Joseph, now my belief for group dynamics purposes that would be that it'd be wise now to have people get into pairs for a few minutes and just talk to a peer about, well, what sense are they making out of all of that? What kind of questions do they have? So this would be where I would do that.
Yeah, so you got the option.
Okay, we can do that randomly. So
yes,
let's proceed. So I'm going to put you into pairs in breakout rooms. And I choose pairs because it will give you the maximum amount of opportunity to speak. So half the people can be speaking in just a moment here. So just for math purposes, it's the highest engagement arrangement. And then we'll come back and have a group conversation.
Right. How long is this session?
This will be 7 minutes with
All
the
right,
partner.
great. Okay.
Okay, and let's see, how many people are here? 57. Oops, got a couple more rows. Got my math wrong. Okay. There you go. Hello. Ms. Jenny? Are you here? If you are, I'd be happy to talk to you. Perhaps your computer's on mute. It doesn't look like your Zoom functions are muted. Okay, let me see. I don't know if you can hear me, but I'm going to put you into a breakout room with one of the other participants. Let's see. Oh, okay. Hello. Welcome. You have arrived in the midst of a breakout where the other participants are in pairs having conversations about the lecture. And I'm the lecturer. You're welcome to chat with me in the meantime, if you wish.
Sir,
Good morning.
Hello.
Sir, I got into the breakout room and I didn't had anybody with me, and I just tried coming back to the main room, but I got locked out. If you can just pair me with somebody.
Okay.
Sir, now you are the host. You can do it.
Well, it is done. Now, if the other two of you just joined, I'd be happy to give you a 60-second recap. And everyone's going to come back in just a moment here. All right, it is time.
So are you asking me if I would like a 60-second recap?
Yes, except now it's going to be more like a 5-second recap.
I'm good. Thank you, sir. A big fan, by the way. Big fan.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
All right, well, welcome back, everyone. You automatically are muted when you come out of the breakout rooms. So if you wish to be heard, please unmute. And I'd like to just have this be an open discussion at this point for a bit. Any comments or questions?
Gilmore Sadeep here. This is pertaining to the concept of marginal man, where you spoke about power dynamics in the organization, and there is a majority group and there's a minority group. So is there a specific measure of power distribution in an organization, and how as OD practitioners we will be able to identify and utilize the distribution?
I don't know about measuring the power in the organization. As Lewin said, power is an aspect of every group. And so I'm more interested in having the group and the person in charge have dialogue about how it's working. And then also in the training, I want everyone to help each other in their roles and see each other as peers, as human beings. So I want to influence people's thinking around, certainly if they for some reason think they're better than other human beings, I think that's a false hypothesis. And so that's, yeah, I know I've never my father created one of the first, maybe the first computerized employee surveys, the people performance profile, back in like 1980. It came out, you know, you had these huge readouts, big rolls of paper. It was high tech at the time. And so there were many questions about authority and how it was working. So I guess we measured authority by whether or not people thought they were listened to by whoever they worked for, and things like that. So you can measure power dynamics. You'd have to decide how to operationalize it. What are the dynamics you're attempting to understand? And then we always used it immediately for a dialogue between the group and the person they reported to, because that's more what we were interested in, was the dialogue and the action planning. When I was a boy of 24, besides being with my father while he worked with that citizens project in Spokane, Washington for the park that I mentioned, he had a contract at that point with tomato paste factories and tomato products. Contadina is the company. And I don't know if you've ever heard of that company, but they made, you know, tomato sauce, canned tomatoes, tomato paste. And I had two factories where I worked with every group in both factories. And all I did was follow a process of the employees and the supervisor together evaluating, are they getting what they need from each other? Are they getting what they need from other groups? Is it clear what the goals are? Are the standards of safety clear? They would have a dialogue and come up with their own solutions within that work group. And then some of the solutions were about the whole place. If people said, well, we don't really understand what the goals of the factory are, then that was a solution that did have to elevate and then be addressed at the top. But mostly, I was 24, I didn't know anything except to follow the process. And it worked.
Right.
I mean, all those places just had higher productivity, better morale, and we measured all that with surveys.
Gil, I might just extend Sandeep's question differently, especially because you made mention that it could be a false hypothesis in considering power distance. Would that go back to a root value if you were to put yourself in Lewin's shoes, that people are made equal and therefore any measurement might increase the divide and therefore it's an unintentional consequence of measurement? Naughty question, but I'm just putting it to you.
Well, I certainly, Lewin absolutely thought that all people were equal. And so he had a strong value around that. And even at the University of Berlin, apparently in the 1920s, at the University of Berlin, and you know, I don't know exactly what your culture is within this school, but it's probably not like it was at University of Berlin. You did not ask questions of the lecturer at the University of Berlin. That was strictly verboten, against the rules. And so it didn't matter if you were the best and brightest student, you were not to raise your hand and ask questions. You did not have any time with the professor. When I was in college, I could go and have meetings with my professors. That's just not how it was at that time in Berlin. It was absolutely, there was a separation between students and professors. But Lewin, as a graduate student, started teaching, and when he taught, he would have coffee with the students, and they would talk into the wee hours of the night. And he would, they helped him check his theories, and many of them were women, and that was unheard of at the time. So he absolutely lived his belief that all people are equal. And you have to understand roles, and you need to know how to follow. If you're working for somebody, you need to know how to help their roles succeed, which includes raising issues to them so that they actually know what's happening. Because most people, as they go higher in organizations, know the least, because everyone's afraid to speak or to raise issues. So you have to figure out in your own way, how do I raise issues here? And it may be that it's very direct, it may be very indirect. There's many ways to do it, and it's best if the leader helps with the conversation. Like I always, with the people I work for, say, if I'm troubled by something, do you want to hear it? Or how would you like me to bring it to you? And so we create a little contract around that. But now it's partially my function. But I wouldn't want to live any other way. So now, Joseph, whether or not, if you measure power, you could inadvertently make the tension worse. I mean, if that's what you meant, I think the answer is yes, especially if all you do is measure, like with an employee survey, and then you don't do anything about it, or nothing happens. That will make the tension worse. So, what else?
Yeah, I invite students to engage here. Jill and I are more regular interaction folks, so go ahead.
Hi, Gilmore. This is Hitesh. Firstly, congratulations on the book. And as an OD student, this book for me couldn't be more timely. So thank you for that. And the question to you, the question to you is, both Sanjay and me were discussing in our breakout rooms on T groups that you had mentioned earlier. And we were very curious to know, in the current environment where organizations operate in a very agile and high expectation mode, can we really do justice to T groups in the current organization setting? And if so, how can we kind of go ahead with that? So yeah, thanks.
Sure. Well, so first thing I want to do is, now I can only see maybe 25 of you at a time right now. We've got, a couple screens going here worth of people, which is great. But raise your hand if you found the breakout room conversation stimulating. Just raise your hand. Okay, so there's, maybe 2/3 or something of the hands went up there. Maybe more. Okay, and so group dynamics is to allow people to speak, and we're in a situation now where the size of this group is so big that it's just not practical unless we go back to small conversations again. And so if you want people to be alive and to really learn, you have to figure out ways to increase dialogue. And T groups is a way to do that. Now, this isn't a T group, but I would say a couple things. Mr. Kamdar, is that correct?
Yes,
one
Gilmore.
is people have been frantic for a long time in organizations, pressured, anxious, trying to, get things to happen fast. So don't panic and get caught up in that. It's, of course, you want to help things move forward as quick as you can, but the sort of myth that somehow we have to move faster and faster and faster is actually one of the problems. That's a restraining force. Friedman, who's one of my sources, he was a family systems therapist, called it being chronically anxious, and said that a dysfunctional behavior is quick fix thinking, where people are trying to cram in solutions and trying to do them without enough resources, and then fail to get the results they were hoping for, and then they blame the solution instead of recognizing what, as Friedman put it, you can't make a bean grow by pulling on it. You have to give the right amount of time, the right amount of resources, the right amount of sunshine, the right amount of water to things if you want them to actually happen right. And there's no perfect answer for how much is the right amount, but in most places, people are doing too much, and so then they're doing it poorly, and then they're upset with each other and embarrassed, and there's all kinds of covering oneself to try not to get blamed, and so helping people be honest about, well, what do we really need to do this right, and how much time is an important function. And then T groups can help people have those kinds of conversations. So and right now, what I've discovered is that you can do these things online, which is, pretty astounding, really. So Kurt Lewin never got to do a virtual T group, but all a T group is that you're talking in the moment about, well, how's this moment working for you? Are you getting what you want right now? And if you want something different, what's your own restraining force, in a sense? And what's your emotion about what's happening between you and the others? You're talking about what's really happening in the group that you're in a T group, and learning from that. And so it's, I think everybody should be in a T group at some point in their lives. And it used to be that OD people, all the OD people were in T groups before they did OD. So that you would learn to pay attention to your gut when you were in a meeting with the people you were trying to help. And you would learn to check whether or not you understood what somebody else meant. Because the process of understanding is fragile. It's easy to misunderstand. So if you get a chance to be in a T group, I highly recommend it. And, whether or not you ever help other people or organizations do it, there's only one way to find out, I guess, but it's not the simplest thing to convince people
of. Gil, again, to help Hitesh, Mr. Kamdar, as he called him. Recently, you were called on to a Scrum Master event. Can you explain that so that there's relevance and contemporariness to that question?
Is that a question for me?
Yes.
No, you can help me, Joseph. I was in a Scrum Master event, and I was mostly talking about Lewinian methods. I'm not sure I understand at this point.
The question was that how would T groups be relevant in a time-pressured, agile project environment? And it was only perhaps a month or two ago that you were invited to, or invited by a Scrum Master for something, right?
Sure.
That's where I wanted you to bring relevance to the question that Hitesh asked. Yeah.
Thanks. I'm running a T group right now for a management team. And what they're realizing is that they waste a lot of time because they don't talk to each other about what they need to talk about. And that happens in many different ways. So if there's no doubt, trying to do a T group when you're already in the middle of a project would be hard. Although like a plant that's operating is always operating. So there's never a good time to just take some time away. You have to just choose to do it. But the intent, and it's been proven over and over again, is to save time. If people raise issues in a way that's respectful, and then they were able to address the issues and prevent having to do rework, and then you're saving time. I mean, all of this is an ounce of prevention versus a pound of cure. So really, and that's the only reason people pay for it, is the ones that get it, that they could save time if they were more effective at their conversations about difficult issues. So that's certainly anybody that's my pleasure. What else? I mean, it's funny, I can only see 24 or 25 of you. I know there's a bunch of others out there.
Hey Gil, Rashmi here. Morning. Thank you so much for doing this for all of us. It's really an honor and privilege. My question is around group decision making. How, in the current given context, one with the pandemic and most teams moving towards remote working, do you see a place for it? And second, the efficacy of it, right? With group decision making, there are both sides to increasing ownership, but there's also a danger of group polarization, right? So the second part of the question is, I thought in general, decision making also has an accountability piece, or there is, ownership piece to it. So in a group, how does that work? Because you can't be distributing ownership across, say if the group is about 15 members. Just curious to learn about these two things from you.
I'll do my best. So thank you. I just worked with Campari during 2020. One of my main active contracts was with Campari. They make an Italian liqueur.
Bitters, yes.
And then there's various other, like Heineken, that's part of their portfolio and so on. And so they, of course, were functioning during the pandemic. And they're fortunate. They have a product that people continue to consume even when times are rough. So what I helped them with was every person in North America and South America in their company that was in a management position first was in sessions where they looked at restraining forces. They were especially concerned about, they had low scores on engagement and communication in a recent employee survey. Nothing unusual, but they wanted to see what they could do about that. So they engaged at looking at restraining forces that would prevent effective communication and engagement. And then they went and every one of them, 250 different groups, they went and ran their own session with their employees, where the employees talked about, well, what's in the way of communication and engagement, came up with their own solutions, and came up with local solutions that were just for that group, but also passed on solutions to the whole organization about like how they manage Zoom meetings. They just were in a new world where people were booking everybody constantly in meetings all day long, and now they had more meetings than ever instead of less, especially the white collar employees. It was bad enough before the pandemic. They were in too many meetings. Now they were in meetings all the time. And that was one system-wide issue. So I don't find if the process is facilitated well, if it's clear about what the goals are, I just don't find that it causes polarization to engage, to give people a chance to talk about what's working and what isn't working. And this was one of the least facilitated processes because they went out and did it themselves. I coached them all on non-defensive reception of feedback. And so it was a minimal sprinkling of training, really. And then they had follow-up sessions, and they're very happy with the outcome. So even in this environment with Zoom, it's possible to engage people in identifying what's in the way. And of course, it's important to do that respectfully. If you just say to whoever's in charge that, well, the only thing that's in the way is you, those are fighting words. And it'd be better to have people get more specific, like they think they could make more decisions, or they think they could work a longer period of time before writing a report about what they're doing, or whatever it is. There's always a tension. Now, this is back to Lewin, between structure and freedom in every group. And you have to provide enough structure, or that will cause issues. A lot of people say they don't know what the priorities are. They don't get enough information from whoever they're working for. And you have to provide enough structure, which is unique to you and your group. And then you have to provide as much freedom as you can. If people know, especially if you have a group of experienced workers, you want to give them freedom to just get the work done. If they're delivering, let them deliver. If you have a group of new people, of course, you have to give them more structure. So it's always an art for every leader. But those are the two things that one must balance: structure and freedom. And by freedom, I mean engagement around, opportunities for engagement. That provides, you have to have structure. So you have to say, okay, you're going to have a session now where people get to talk about what's working and what's not working, what's in the way. That's structure to give people freedom to influence. So does that make sense? Rashmi?
Yes, that's right. Yeah, I think you mentioned the art part of it. Balancing the structure and the freedom makes a lot of sense in the way you're engaging. What about accountability for these decisions? You still think if you're doing a group decision process, what about the accountability?
Yeah, it's Lewin said group decision. I wouldn't have used those words exactly. To me, it's more like group commitment. If your peers think it makes sense, you're more likely to give something a try. And that was clear in his research. The person in charge of the group has to say, okay, here's 10 things that the group came up with to try. And I want you to go ahead and try these 9 things, but this 10th thing, we can't do it. I know we can't do it. I'm not going to get the management above me to give us, Porsches and satellite dishes or whatever. I mean, so it's not going to, but now maybe there's some other approach. You could come back to me, but this one isn't going to happen. So the person in that position still has to either sign off on experimentation or say no and explain why, of course.
Thank you so much.
No problem. I'll tell you what will create polarization. And there are many OD people that do this because I run into it almost every time I go to a new place, a new organization. I hear that a person was hired to facilitate. They called themselves an organization development person. And they said to a group, just tell each other the truth. Tell each other what you really think of each other. It's okay. And so the last place I was, the supervisor had quit in tears after a session like that. People had said, "You're the most awful person I've ever worked for," and so on. That's not. That will cause polarization. You got to create the structure of, okay, it's important to talk about issues, and it's important to do it in a way where you're being thoughtful about the other people that you're talking to. And then especially the person in charge has to still be good at knowing that not everyone's going to be smooth when they give feedback. And so they need to be the most patient person when it comes to receiving feedback. If a person says you're a micromanager, if I just get defensive and say, no, I'm not, then I'm going to kill dialogue. I have to be able to say, look, that troubles me, but I'm glad you're telling me about your concern. Now, what specifically do you wish I was doing different? And then if you can get that to the specifics, well, I wish you wouldn't always sit in the room when I'm leading and, why don't you just, I'd like to be able to do this without your oversight, that you can talk about it. And then you have to decide. The person in charge still has to decide. Yes, I could give you more freedom, or no, on this, I need to, for my own sanity, keep the structure the way it is. So you have to decide, but you can't decide if you don't find out what you're being told. If you just reject it, then you can't decide. We have 15 more minutes. What else? Who else?
Hi, Gilmore. Hi, Gilmore. This is Rashmi.
Hello.
Thank you for taking us through the presentation. Thank you for taking us through the presentation and feel more closely aware of Kurt Lewin and his change process. Thank you for giving that presentation to us. Abhijit and I were discussing about how he drew a lot of inspiration from physics and applied it into the social sciences. So our question is, with group dynamics in background, how can we identify the control group and the experiment group? Understanding what behaviors that we want to keep as a controlled and what behaviors do we want to really experiment with? How do we decide on those groups? And second part would be, once we have introduced those catalysts or different experiments within the experimental group, how do we measure those impact within the group? So that's the question.
It's a good question. So for one, the control group, I don't always have a control group. My customers are paying me to help improve performance, usually across like the whole location or organization. So they don't want a control group. They want everybody to improve. Now, if you are in an organization, like I did a lot of work for the Aluminum Company of America, also known as Alcoa. And I'm sure I worked in at least 30 locations. Now there, the control groups could be the locations that didn't do OD. So, we could compare the metrics of the locations that did OD with the ones that didn't. And there were some pretty dramatic metrics at times, most of the time, for the ones that did. And so then they kept wanting us to go to the next location because that was one type of control group. Like in Lewin's graph about industry, the control groups were all the other groups in the plant that didn't do OD. And then there were several groups that did, and they all trended up. So you could just do it like that. And then the metrics that I've been taught to use all my life are the metrics of the organization that already exist. So if they have, for instance, a certain number of quality issues and they track that, and then if you're doing OD that can influence quality, then the quality metrics should improve. If they have, if they're tracking safety, certainly if they're tracking production, output, returns, okay, scrap. In any kind of production process, if they're scrapping a material, they will want to reduce scrap. That'll save them a lot of money. So those are the metrics that mostly my father and I work with, is the actual metrics of the organization. Now, sometimes we use surveys, and then the survey can be a metric if you repeat it. So that's another, like an annual survey. Mostly I'm after performance metrics because that's what people want, is to have better performance. And so it helps you get the next job if the last place you helped is now making more money, or whatever it is, the metric would be. In social service agencies, the one that I worked in recently, the metric was that they keep kids who had come from broken homes in school. So their goal was to not have these kids become high school dropouts. And they definitely increased their success in that through a lot of T-group learning. That was one thing they did. They needed to have all the people working with the kids get better at relating. So does that help, Rashmi?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Gilmore. One thing I would like to get more clarity is, the metrics has to be always performance oriented, or can it be behavioral oriented as well?
Well, in the right now, I'm in the midst of a leadership development program, and we have the students from the very beginning to the very end, they're working on certain behaviors, and we let them know right at the beginning what those behavioral goals are. And then we have them midway through fill out scales about how they think they're doing and how they think 3 of their peers are doing. And they exchange those notes and have conversations about it and try to learn from it. And then by the end, we rate them on all these different behaviors. So you certainly can assess behaviors and use that as, mostly I think they're useful if it's a means for further learning. I'm suspicious of organizations that rate people, and then if they rated in the lower percentile, they fire them or they don't give them opportunities. I think that's would lead to more tension and suspicion about the rating process. People will be afraid when they're rating because they will have fear for their careers. And anyway, I think it can be used wisely, and I think it can be done poorly.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your response.
My pleasure. One thing, in the US, we have these assessment centers. And people come in sometimes, like in Pico Nuclear, a company I worked with, they would go in for their assessment. It would be 2 days, maybe 3 days. A team of psychologists would watch them. There would be no interaction with the psychologists. And they would write a report and they would say, this person can't manage more than 20 people and things like that. And it destroyed careers. So, you know, to me, that's a bad use of behavioral science, if you want to call it behavioral science. Helping people figure out where are they now and what can they work on is a good use. So Joseph, there's 7 more minutes. Are you getting what you were hoping for here?
I was open to whatever you were giving. And in that sense, I'm more concerned if our participants are anyway close to what their expectations were. Maybe they could chat away to make it faster, or maybe entertain at least one more question.
So, may I?
Yes, please, Amit.
So Gilmore, thank you first of all for taking time on a Saturday evening. Another thing that I wanted to tell you was I really appreciated the way that you used examples of application in the real world that helps us understand the theory in a better way. At least it helps me understand the theory in a better way. Have you used similar examples in your book as well?
Yes. So in the Plan Change book, towards the end, there's just a chapter on organization development and examples, you know, lots of examples. So yes, there's quite a few examples in the book. And that's a book about Lewin. Now, Dad's book, you have that manuscript. He was saying chapter 13, I want to talk about chapter 13, which was using force field analysis and so on. There's certainly a lot of examples in Dad's book also. You know, Joseph, I just want to say too, before we're out of time, that I'd be happy to respond to any of you privately after this. You know, I want people to use Lewin to make the world a better place, inside organizations and outside. So one of my favorite projects right now is I'm trying to help reduce gun violence in the city I live in, which has the most teenagers getting shot of any city in the United States. And so I'm just beginning in this process, and I hope it works. But these same methods can be used in so many ways.
So Gil, as a response, may I add that I've already created structure for people to write to you with their email IDs. And they probably reflect a little before doing that. Thanks for bringing the request from your side as well.
No problem. So we have a few more minutes.
Gilmore, if I may just ask, it's not directly related to the subject, but since you are here, I would, you know, if if you can share what is the best advice that you have received from your dad. I wanted to ask him this, but since he's not here, if you could please share that.
Best advice that I've ever received from my dad. I've received a lot of good advice from my dad. So that's a tough one. That's a tough one. It's a lovely question. You know, I don't know if it was advice so much as he just has been a role model for me. He invented a school where the students could influence the curriculum. And I was in that when I was 11, I was in that. It started with 3 weeks of T group learning. It was, so for 7 years of my life, I was in this experimental school. In Nashville, when I was small, it was segregated. So in the US at that time, blacks and whites were not allowed to live in the same areas. And Dad would have black families over. And yeah, I'm proud of my mom. She passed away recently, but we'd be outside playing with the family and she'd be inside taking calls from people who were threatening to kill us and telling them to go jump in the lake, which is really more polite than what she told them. But my dad was the pastor, so he's a United Methodist minister, and the pastor's wife was telling these people what they could do with their threats. And so he's always fought for social justice and done OD work. And there's just, I don't know if I can boil it down to one thing, but I've been blessed. I was blessed with loving parents.
Thanks, Gilmore. I think the emotion in the answer says it all. So thank you so much for the response.
I'm sad he couldn't be on here. We'll have to figure this out again someday.
Sure. Gilmore, hi, this is Jennifer here. And I'm just being cognizant of the time. I'll write to you separately, but this is something which I want to ask is, right now the organizations are doing a lot of work with reference to inclusion and diversity. And a challenge which I am facing at the workplace, being part of this project, is that people speak at a very shallow level when we try to do group work, right? So, we know that, in society, things aren't really right, the systems aren't working, and, there are things happening world over. So any insight that you can offer us on how do we, take away that fear of repercussion, or, get people to speak up in a more deep and true sense when it comes to their needs of inclusion, because these topics are also very sensitive, they're very personal to individuals. And, somewhere there emerges a wall or a boundary where people don't want to speak beyond, say, gender or ageism or disability, or, the more visible things, and truly speaking about things, which may be related to communities, which may be related to queer identities, etc. How do we, bring in that dialogue? If you could share something on that.
Well, I'm not hired usually to help people have conversations about diversity. Although the social service agency I mentioned earlier, that is exactly what they wanted. They wanted to have T group learning where they were specifically talking about gender and race as it was showing up in their own organization. So they were very brave, but that took a leader that said, this is what I want to have the organization explore. And so so for me, what I'm doing constantly is helping people have dialogue about the work where each voice is being respected. So at least during that process, there's a balancing and an evening out and an opportunity. But if I'm not being hired to address specifically those issues, I address them when they arise. There was a small plant I was at just 2 years ago where I thought it was done, and they had all kinds of tension, and it really had shifted in a couple of visits, and so we were in this sort of wrap-up meeting, and it turned out that one of the Black management employees thought that a white management employee was racist and was treating him a certain way because of racism. And that I helped them. I asked if I could try to work this thing, and they let me. And they really turned out that there was just a lot of misunderstanding. And so it's not always going to be that way. But I believe that's really true for that case. The white employee had done the same thing to me. That kind of helped. Like I had walked in and turned into their office, and they never looked up at me. They never acknowledged I was there when I arrived. I thought, well, maybe that person's upset with me, and I decided to go on down the hall to the next person, and let it be for now. And so that person had an unintended impact, and it was happening more than once. And it turned out that it happened with a bunch of people, Black, white, male, female. Mm-hmm. So anyway, they managed to get past it with some help. But what I really need, if whatever I'm doing, is I need to have the person who's in charge want the help, and then it can expand from there. But I'm mostly working diversity in organizations by helping people be heard, everybody be heard, and not explicitly trying to address things in a different way than that, unless the leader wants that done. Now, if it was horrible, then I would have to step in. If it was just overt in some way, racism or sexism, then I have to decide whether I wanted to work for that person, and maybe address it privately with them quickly if I believe that was happening. It's not easy.
No, not at all.
For the state of Delaware right now, I'm working with the African American Task Force to work on social justice, specifically reducing gun violence. There I'm being asked to help with racial issues as well as other types of issues. So there it's great. I feel free to do whatever talk about whatever I think is important. And so that's a different authorization. Now, Joseph, we have now slipped slightly past the time.
Yeah, that's because we started a little past time.
Okay.
So that's fine. But I'm really happy that you could give your Friday evening way into almost midnight, perhaps, where your father may have been, but we'd like to make it up to him. Maybe we create a structure where he initiates it and we're on to that forum. Perhaps that's something we could do sometime later. But thank you so much for sharing and holding on to what you thought was structure. I began by saying that your context is one of a new hope in America right now, in the largest of institutions that you may have. But right now, I'm thinking that the way you unfolded the session, you really opened up to the pathos that your family held, even as you give off this work unto this day. Just as Lewin held on to his pathos of being discriminated against in Prussia, and then of course later in the US as well. Not many people know that he faced academic humiliation, or rather in the academic community as well. So the use of self is not something that comes as a gift from above, but we got to work into it. And that's the sense I'm specifically calling to occasion here, so that our students have a wedge between this session and the rest of their work lives, as it were. I'm sure they like to be in touch with you, alumni too, and what else can I say? Let's stay in touch.
We must. So thank you, everyone. I appreciate such a gracious and engaged audience.
Well, that's your luck. That's your good fortune, and my good fortune too. So thank you, everybody who joined today. I hope you got a sense from people who worked almost in the shadow of Kurt Lewin. If they couldn't touch his flesh and bone, well, this is the closest that we could get. If you were to pick up the book given by Gilmore, or rather written by Gilmore, you will know more than a life sketch in there. He's really made it easy reading. I had the pleasure of reviewing it. I'm glad he's included my review in the inner pages of the book. So thank you. See you later.
Take care.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you, Gilmore.
Bye there.
Thanks, Gilmore. Thank you.
Bye. Rija, just stay on call. We'll just connect.